So, as promised, this is the application of the different electoral systems to the fictional world of Westeros from the Game of Thrones books and TV series, with appropriate thanks to George R.R. Martin. And the aim of putting together this section of slides is to demonstrate to you the different effects that the different electoral systems can have when used on the same territory. So it's really important for you to appreciate that these different electoral systems have both mechanical and psychological effects on both the population who's voting, but also the elites who are leading the political parties. Now, the demographic breakdown of Westeros should not be intended to reflect convergence with what's in the books. I've taken the liberty of changing quite a lot of things simply to illustrate the points I want to make. It's important to appreciate that, as well as looking at the simple demographics of a country, you also need to look at where the groups are located, and I'll move on to that in a minute. And it's also important to look at the history of relations between the groups, because that will make them more or less likely to come into coalition or to cooperate with each other. You are also choosing an electoral system based on what you want to achieve. So you will have views on whether you think it's appropriate to try to gain the centrist ground, to try to instill moderation before the election, so that you could have, for example, a seat sharing arrangement, or you could encourage groups to give your second preferences to your group. Or you could adopt a different approach, that you think it's important that the different groups show their strength in the election, and this can embolden and also strengthen their elite members, so that when they come together bargaining after the election, they are doing so from a position of strength. Now, as we've talked about in previous lectures, there are different mechanisms that you can use in presidential systems. For example, as in Bosnia-Herzegovina, you can have a collective rotating presidency. In Afghanistan, they had two vice presidents who would normally come from different ethnic groups than the president. Or you could choose an electoral system where the president either has to get a majority or a plurality of votes, but also has to achieve a certain percentage of votes in various regions or states across the country. And we see that in Nigeria and Kenya. But what I'm going to talk about in the next few slides is going to be primarily applicable to parliamentary systems. It is important, however, to stress that in your policy report, if you want to have a presidential system, there's no reason you need to choose the same electoral system to elect the president as you do to elect the parliament. So here is Westeros. You can see that this is a very ethnically divided society. No family has a majority of the population. And this is similar to many countries of the world, Ethiopia, Kenya, Afghanistan and Bosnia-Herzegovina, to name just four. In what I'm going to discuss, I'm going to assume that the different families will generally vote for their own family member in elections. Now, that may not be the case in reality, but for simplicity's sake, I'm going to assume that. And when I don't assume that, I will make that explicit. Now, the largest group, the Lannisters, have historically held power. You can see the Lannisters there in the west of the country, in the kind of shaded light blue area. But you also have sizable groups such as the Targaryens on the east of the country, but with some pockets in the Lannister areas, and the Dornish in the south of the country in this greyish blue area that looks a bit like a crab's claw. And then you have smaller groups such as the Starks and the Greyjoys in the north and the northwest of the country, who wanted autonomy for a long time for their cultural systems. And you can read more about their preferences in the policy report brief I've given you. So the Starks up in the north here control a very large area, but it's actually quite sparsely populated. The Greyjoys are a very small 5% of the population and are confined only to the Iron Islands. So what do the different electoral systems actually give us in terms of results to play around with here? Now, before I move on to discuss the different systems, I've got put down here the ethnic breakdown of the different constituencies. And that's something you can refer back to when you want to get the sense of how different demographics affect the different vote shares that you might get under different political electoral systems. So, let's first look at party list. And this is a system that is advocated by people like Aaron Lightpart for power sharing consociational frameworks. And it's sometimes also advocated because it's an easy system to explain. You simply vote for a party. Parties produce a list of candidates to vote for. Either for a nationwide constituency, as you can see that they've done in Westeros. It's not divided up into different constituencies for this electoral system, or you could have a system such as they have in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where you have separate lists for different constituencies, different multi-member constituencies. And the party list system essentially takes the votes and converts them completely proportionally into seat share. It's important to note that you have two different types of party list system. The first one is an open party list, where you can vote not just for the party, but you can also express a preference between who comes higher up the list that the party has nominated. So you might not fancy Sansa Stark being at the top of that list, and you might want to vote for Brandon Stark instead, or any other member on the Stark list lower down. And then that would have to be taken into account. So in this example, the Starks have 18% of the population, they get 18% of the seats, but those 18% of the seats would then have to be allocated depending on the preferences for the individuals on that list that people had expressed in the Stark area. Now, you then have the closed list, where Sansa Stark has the power to set who's in on that list and in what order. And that not only gives her more power, because then she has her favourites at the top of the list, because those are the ones who are most likely to be elected, but it can also be a good way if Sansa wants to include more women higher up the ranks, for example, because generally women may not do as well on some electoral systems as they do on others. And if you want to increase female representation, that's quite a good way of doing it. So we can see that all 5 families here, 35% of the population leads to 35% of the seat for the Lannisters. For the Greyjoys, 5% of the population leads to 5% of the seats in Parliament. And there's no deviation from proportionality between their share of the population and the seats, and that's why the deviation from proportionality is 0 for all 5 families. And this means that you're going to end up with a very polarised parliament. So we can see that the Lannisters have 35% of the seats in this parliament, but they're not going to be able to control the government by themselves. So who are they going to rule with? We know that there have been hugely conflictual relations between the Lannisters and the Targaryens throughout history. They're never going to form a coalition because of that bad history between them. So you might get the Lannisters forming an alliance with the Dornish, which would then give them, 57% of the seats overall. Or an alternative alliance, however, if groups wanted to keep the Lannisters out, could be between the Dornish, the Starks and the Targaryens. So the Dornish, Starks and the Targaryens. And this would be the smallest alliance that could be formed that would defeat the Lannisters. If they wanted to be particularly inclusive, they could also include the Greyjoys within that coalition. But generally we know that people try to have a minimal winning coalition if they can, because that means they don't have to distribute the spoils of government so widely. Now, in this situation, if you have a 4 or a 3-person alliance, if we go back and we take the Dornish out there, you can see that 2 groups are going to be left out of government, both the Lannisters and the Greyjoys. And it's important to recognise that even the most inclusive of proportional electoral systems may guarantee representation in Parliament, but it doesn't guarantee representation in government. And that's why other institutional forms, such as a formal power sharing, or whether that be federalism, so you have autonomy in your own area, or whether that be polyethnic rights. So the rights of both the Greyjoys and the Lannisters to maintain their own religion or to use their own language, for example. Now, if we move on to look at the next slide, we'll look at simple plurality. Now, this is a system that we have for elections at the national level in the United Kingdom. And for the sake of simplicity, you can see that I've divided Westeros up into 10 different constituencies. And obviously, you would normally expect a parliament or a national assembly to have a lot more than 10 constituencies, but this makes it quite easy to calculate the numbers. Now, the first thing you should notice is that the deviation from proportionality is very high in this system. So the Lannisters, with 35% of the population, have got 5 seats, which is 50% of the parliament. And they have their deviation from proportionality, therefore, is 15% more than they should do. In contrast, if we look at the Greyjoys, they only have 5% of the population. Remember, they're only in the Iron Islands over on the west of the country. But they haven't got any seats. Now, why is this the case? Now, we know that in simple plurality electoral systems, you only need a plurality of the vote to be elected. You don't need to have a majority. And so you can see here that in constituencies 1 and 2, the Starks with 100% of the population in those areas are going to win those seats. But if we move to constituency 3, because the Starks are 70% of the population there, and the Greyjoys are only 30% of the population in constituency 3 as a whole, the Starks are going to secure the seat, and the Greyjoys are not going to have any representation at all. Now, let's look at the Dornish. They have 20% of the population, but they only get 10% of the seats. Their deviation from proportionality is minus 10%. And you can see again, looking at the map, why this happens. The Dornish clearly win constituency 10 because 100% of the population is Dornish in those areas, in that particular constituency. But if you look, Constituency number 9 is dominated by the Lannisters, who have 60% of the population there. The Targaryens over here and the Dornish over here in the east have 20% of the population, but the Lannisters are going to take that seat. So if we now move to look at constituency number 8, the Lannisters don't have a majority of the population in constituency number 8. They only have 40% of the population. The Targaryens have 35% of the population, and the Dornish have 25% of the population of that constituency. But because the Lannisters only need a plurality of the vote to be elected, they win that seat too. So the Lannisters get 5 seats. They get constituencies 4, 5, 6, 8 and 9. And these constituencies give them 50% of the vote in the assembly. Now, you might look at these boundaries and think they're a bit odd. Why have they been drawn like that? Now, I mentioned before that the Lannisters have been in control of Westeros for a long time. This is a perfect example of Lannister gerrymandering to ensure that certain groups get less representation. So, who is going to form the government in this scenario? Now, the Lannisters have 50% of the seats, but that's not going to be enough. So what you would probably end up with is an alliance between the Lannisters and the Dornish, which would give them a majority of 60% of seats. Now, it's possible you could have the Lannisters and the Starks coming together instead, which would give them a bigger majority of 80% of the seats. But then the Lannisters would have to make serious concessions to the Starks, in a way that they probably wouldn't have to with the Dornish, because the Dornish are a weaker coalition partner. Let's move on to the alternative vote system. Now, this is still a majoritarian system, but unlike simple plurality, you have to get a majority of the votes in a particular constituency to be elected. And it's also a preferential system. And that means that people, when they're voting, don't just vote for their first candidate. They have a chance to express their preference for their second or third or fourth candidate as well. And candidates know this. And this means that there's an incentive for candidates to appeal not just to their core ethnic group, or in this case, family members, but to other families as well. Now, someone like Donald Horowitz argues that this is a really good mechanism for ethnically divided societies, because it means that the candidates who aren't going to achieve 50% of the vote in a particular constituency have an incentive to become moderates, to tone down their rhetoric against other communities or other families in this scenario, or maybe even to offer those families something in return for putting them as their second preference. So even though that family or ethnic group may not be represented in Parliament from that constituency, their interests may be represented in Parliament. And let's go and have a look at how this works in practice. One important thing to mention, however, is that this only works, this system, when groups are territorially intermixed. They have to be mixed together in the same constituency. So for the point of this illustration, we can ignore constituencies 1, 2 and 10 because these are homogeneous, and the Starks are going to win numbers 1 and 2 and the Dornish are going to win number 10. Now, what you see in constituency number 3 is the same as under simple plurality. The Starks are going to win because they have 70% of the population. They don't need to appeal to the Greyjoys. And if we actually go down and look, and you can see that in all the constituencies, with the exception of constituency number 8, because there's a majority group there, the outcome is going to be the same as simple plurality. But there is a difference in constituency number 8, because you will see there you've got the three groups there: the Lannisters, the Targaryens and the Dornish. But the Lannisters only have 40% of the population. So what's going to happen there is that if people vote according to family lines, the Lannisters will get 40% of the first preference votes, the Targaryens will get 35% of the first preference votes, and the Dornish will get 25% of the first preference votes. No one's achieved a majority. So what then happens? The Dornish candidate, because they got the less votes with 25% of the population, is eliminated. And their second preference votes will be distributed between the Targaryens and the Lannisters until one of them achieves over 50% of the population. Now, how are those second preference votes going to be distributed? Are they going to go to the Lannisters? Well, the Lannister candidate's been very, very high-handed towards the Dornish and has been, ramping up the rhetoric against the Dornish community. And there's a lot of animosity between the families. In contrast, the Targaryens, and particularly that Targaryen candidate, have been talking about the need to recognise Dornish rights and the need to preserve Dornish cultural autonomy. So the Dornish second preferences go to the Targaryen candidate, and that means that the Targaryen candidate is elected. You can see there with 60% of the vote. And so you can see there that the Targaryens get 2 seats rather than the one that they had under Simple Plurality. So this cross-ethnic bargaining has secured a situation where the Lannisters only now have 40% of the seats. They don't have 50% of the seats. And how's that going to play out in terms of the Parliament? So you could have a situation where you have 40% Lannisters and 30% Starks with 70% of the seats in the Parliament. You couldn't have the Lannisters and the Dornish coming together as we saw under Simple Plurality, because that only gives them 50% of the seats. So an anti-Lannister alliance would much more likely have the Targaryens, the Starks and the Dornish coming together. And that's much more likely because we've already seen the Dornish and the Targaryens having an alliance in constituency 8. And because the Targaryens were talking about the need to preserve cultural autonomy and cultural rights, we know that that's a key demand for the Starks. So the Starks will be quite happy to join that coalition. Now, what happens if we come on to the single transferable vote? Now, this is a very proportional electoral system, and in the case of Westeros, I've kept it simple. So we have 10 constituencies, the same as we had under Simple Plurality and under the alternative vote. The difference here, and one of the reasons it's more proportional, is that each of these constituencies, each of these 10 constituencies, returns 5 members to the Westeros Parliament. And this is, therefore, the district magnitude of each of these constituencies is 5. As with alternative vote, voters can express preferences between the candidates. But unlike alternative vote, the candidates don't require a majority of the votes to be elected. If you think about it, 100 divided into 5 is 20. So all you need is 20% of the votes plus 1 to be elected as a member of that constituency. This means that you're much more likely to see minority candidates being elected because they're going to be much more able to achieve 20% plus 1 than they would be to achieve a plurality or a majority of the votes. So I've put here an abbreviated form of the ethnic breakdown of the constituencies. So you see there Lannisters 70% in constituency 4, Targaryens 30% in constituency 4. So in the first couple of seats we can see that the Starks are 100% of the population. And so Starks are going to secure all 5 of those seats in both constituencies. But what about constituency number 3? Who's going to win the seats there? Now, we know that Starks are 70% of the population of constituency 3. We know that the Greyjoys are 30% of the population of constituency 3. So Starks will win 3 seats, 60% plus 1, and Greyjoys will win 1 seat. But who's going to win that 5th seat? There's going to potentially be some cross-ethnic trading going on there. And who gets that 3rd seat, is very much up for grabs. Are the Starks going to be able to appeal to the Greyjoys to get that 4th seat for them? Or are the Greyjoys going to be able to appeal to some of the Starks? And in this case, what's happening in this area of the territory is that they're actually a bit upset about Winterfell being quite high-handed with relation to their rights. They don't feel they get enough security against the Lannisters here. And they feel that by giving their second preference to a Greyjoy candidate, that's going to send quite a strong signal to the rulers, the Stark rulers in Winterfell. And these same Stark rulers are not being particularly accommodating towards the Greyjoys, so you don't see that same cross-ethnic trading. So what's happening then is you see that 3 seats, in constituency 3, 3 seats go to the Starks, 2 seats go to the Greyjoys. What happens in constituency 4? You've got the same 70-30 split there. But you've got a lot of animosity, we know, between the Targaryens and the Lannisters. In addition, because the Lannisters have been in control of Westeros for so long, and they've been in control of the police and the electoral machinery, so there's quite a lot of intimidation going on. And enough Targaryens are scared into putting their second preference for a Lannister candidate. And so what you see there is that the Lannisters get 4 seats and the Targaryens only get 1 because enough of them were scared into putting their second preference for a Lannister candidate. Now, if we look at constituency number 5, 55-45, you'd expect something like 3 to the Lannisters, 2 to the Targaryens, because the same dynamics of intimidation are going on, and indeed that's what's happening. And the same happens in constituency number 6, although the demographics make it more proportional to the outcome there. 60% of the seats, you'd expect that to lead to 60% of the population share, you'd expect to lead to 3 seats in a 5-member constituency. And indeed, that's what happens. And if we then move on to constituency number 7, again, you've got a 20% Lannister, 80% Targaryen. So you'd expect 4 seats to the Targaryens and 1 seat to the Lannisters. And that's what happens. What about constituency number 8 that we've talked about before? It's broken down roughly in proportion to those populations. You've got Lannisters are 40%, Targaryens 35%, Dornish are 25%. So you'd expect the Lannisters to get 2, you'd expect the Targaryens and Dornish each to get 1, but who's going to get that final seat? And there, we talked before about the alliance between the Targaryens and the Dornish. The Targaryens are promising the Dornish cultural autonomy, and therefore they managed to secure enough second preference votes from the Dornish to win 2 seats in that constituency, even though they've only got 35% of the population. They don't have that 40% of the population to get that second seat without the second preference votes from the Dornish. So what about constituency number 9? Looking at the demographics of that constituency with 60% Lannisters, 20% Targaryens, 20% Dornish, we would expect the breakdown to be 3 3 seats to the Lannisters, 1 seat to the Targaryens and 1 seat to the Dornish. And in fact, that's exactly what we see. The Dornish controlling that whole of that crab claw shaped area, we would expect them to receive all 5 seats from that constituency. And indeed, that's what happens. And you can see in terms of the seat breakdown that although there's still a deviation from proportionality, so the Starks have done quite well because they have been territorially concentrated, generally it's a pretty proportional outcome. But that means that in terms of coalitions, it's all up for grabs, really. There's no one obvious majority coalition that can happen there. And this could be good in terms of ensuring inclusion and inclusivity, but it could also be bad in terms of instability, because you've got the potential for a lot of defections to happen. And that's one of the things that you need to weigh up when you're designing an electoral system for a divided society. Now, if we move to the final system, the additional member system, as it's called in Scotland, Wales and the London Assembly, or the mixed member proportional system, as it's called in Germany. And this system has 2 ballot papers. One is for your constituency representative, so you've got the 10 constituencies there. And the seats for this are allocated as they are under Simple Plurality. It's simply who secures the most votes, a plurality of votes in a constituency. But on the second ballot paper is a list of parties, or families in this case, who want seats in Parliament. You vote for a party who has a list of candidates that they publish in advance. And a vote for a party, or a family in this case, is to make more of that list of candidates into MPs. But importantly, those party votes are used to top up the votes of a particular family or ethnic group or political party to make the outcome a lot more proportional. So once the constituency MPs have been decided, then the second ballots are counted. And the idea is to make the number of MPs for each party match how the country voted on the second ballot paper. So smaller groups, such as the Greyjoys, that aren't territorially concentrated enough to win a constituency MP, as you can see here, actually can then achieve a top-up seat on the party paper. Because under this system, they don't achieve a constituency MP because the Starks take constituency number 3. But the Greyjoys achieve 5% of the vote on the second ballot paper, and therefore they get 1 top-up seat to bring their representation in Parliament to 5%. Let's look at the Starks. They receive 3 constituencies, 1, 2 and 3, so they get 3 seats. And then they receive 1 additional seat in the second ballot to bring their seats up to 20% in the Parliament. And you can see this overall leads to a nearly proportional outcome. So the Starks are slightly overrepresented according to their population. The Targaryens are slightly underrepresented, but overall it's a very proportional system. So who's going to be in this coalition? And as with the single transferable vote, because it's more proportional and because it's a very divided society, it's all up for grabs. And again, you have the trade-off between inclusion versus the potential for instability. So I hope you found that comprehensible and understandable. And I hope that having viewed how different electoral systems play out even on the same territory gives you a sense of how electoral systems are designed and which ones are chosen can make a huge difference. And that's why it's one of the institutions that is often adopted as a means to change behaviour, either for the voters, but as we've talked about, especially in these mixed constituencies like constituency number 8, changing the incentives for the elites to then change their behaviour in terms of how they're mobilising to get more votes. Thanks very much.